My name is Emma Lawson. I'm 33 years old. 5 years ago, my husband looked directly at me, smiled in front of a room full of people, and said 5 words that destroyed my marriage. "You're nothing without me." He didn't whisper it. He didn't say it during an argument. He said it across the dinner table while 12 people watched. Our friends, our neighbors, even his boss. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because sometimes when humiliation hits suddenly, laughing is the only way to keep from crying. 2 weeks later, my husband told me to leave our house. 5 years later, he walked into a job interview at my company, and when he saw the name on the office door, the color drained from his face. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand how someone ends up believing the person they married is worth nothing. And before we go further, tell me something. Have you ever had someone underestimate you so confidently that everyone else believed them? If that's ever happened to you, right, I've been there in the comments, because this story might feel familiar. Let's go back 7 years. Back when Daniel and I were still the couple everyone admired. Daniel was confident, successful, and extremely good at making people like him. He worked as a logistics and manager for a large shipping company. He owned a house before he was 30. He drove a nice car. He was the type of man who walked into a room and instantly became the center of attention. When we first started dating, he used to say things like, "I like that you're simple." At the time, I thought that meant peaceful. Later, I realized what he actually meant was controllable. Our marriage looked perfect from the outside. We hosted dinner parties. We traveled occasionally. We had friends over on weekends. But there was something underneath the surface I didn't understand at the time. Daniel liked control. Not loud control. Not angry. Control. Quiet control. The kind that slowly becomes normal. He handled the finances. He made most of the big decisions. He corrected small things. I said sometimes at first I thought it was harmless. Then it became routine. Eventually it became expected. 3 years into the marriage, I had an idea. A business idea. Nothing huge, nothing dramatic, just something. I had quietly been studying. Small retail stores often struggle with inventory systems. Most of the software available was designed for large corporations. Too expensive, too complicated. I thought I could design something simpler. A system built specifically for small businesses. One night I told Daniel. We were sitting at the kitchen table eating dinner. "I've been thinking about starting something," I said. He looked up from his plate. "What kind of something? A small business?" He stared at me for a moment. Then he laughed. Not loudly, just enough to make the moment feel childish. "Emma," he said, "running a business isn't a hobby. It wouldn't be a hobby." He shook his head. "You've never run anything before?" I didn't argue, but something about his tone stayed with me. A few weeks later, we hosted a dinner party. 12 people, wine, music, laughter, the kind of evening that looks perfect in photos. At one point, someone asked Daniel how work was going. He talked about a promotion possibility. Then he turned to me with a small smile. "Emma has a career plan too," he said. Everyone looked at me. "What kind of plan?" Someone asked. Daniel answered before I could. "She wants to start a company." Someone chuckled. Another person raised their eyebrows. Daniel leaned back in his chair and said the sentence that changed everything. "Emma is sweet, but she's nothing without me." The table exploded in laughter. Someone raised their glass jokingly. I smiled politely, but inside something cracked. Pause here for a second. If someone said that to you in front of your friends, what would you do? Would you leave the table? Would you argue? Or would you sit there smiling like nothing happened? Let me know in the comments what you would have done, because I'm still not sure if I handled that moment the right way. 2 weeks later, the real fight happened. I had started researching the business, quietly watching tutorials, meeting a few small store owners, building a prototype. One night, Daniel came home early. My laptop was open, spreadsheets everywhere. "What's this?" he asked. "Research. For that little business idea." "It's not little," He stared at the screen, then he sighed. "Emma, you're embarrassing yourself." I felt my chest tighten. "I'm just exploring something." He closed the laptop. "You don't understand how hard running a company is. I'm willing to learn." He shook his head. "You're wasting time." That conversation turned into the biggest argument of our marriage. The argument lasted hours. He told me I was being unrealistic. He told me I didn't understand how the real world worked. He told me I should appreciate the life he provided. Then he said the sentence, "I would never forget you're nothing without me, Emma. If you walked out that door tonight, you wouldn't survive a month." For the first time I looked at him and realized something. He believed that completely. 3 weeks later he asked for a divorce. Not because of cheating, not because of betrayal, because I refused to give up the idea. During our final argument, he stood in the hallway holding a suitcase. "If you want to pretend you're some entrepreneur," he said, "go do it somewhere else." I packed quietly. At midnight, I walked out of the house we had shared for 5 years. I had $312 in my bank account and nowhere to go. The first year after the divorce was the hardest year of my life. I lived in a tiny studio apartment above a laundromat. The machines ran all night. The smell of detergent filled the air constantly. Sometimes I slept with headphones on just to block out the noise. During the day, I worked as a receptionist. At night, I did data entry. In between shifts, I built the software, slowly, painfully, sometimes. I wondered if Daniel was right. Sometimes I wondered if I really was nothing without him. But every time that thought appeared, I remembered the dinner table and the laughter, and I kept going. Year 2 changed everything. One small retail store agreed to test my system, then another, then 5, then 15. It turned out the problem I had noticed was real. Small businesses needed simple tools, not complicated corporate software. Word started spreading. More shops called. More stores signed up. For the first time, I realized something important. Daniel wasn't right. He was just louder. Let me stop here again. If you've ever been told your idea wouldn't work, type "keep going" in the comments, because the next part of the story only happens when people keep going even when no one believes in them. Year 3. I hired my first employee. Year 4, we moved into a small office. Year 5, our company had 40 employees and clients across the state. The company was called Stockbridge Systems, and for the first time in my life, I walked into a room knowing I belonged there. Then one Tuesday morning, my assistant walked into my office holding a resume. "We have an interview at 11, she said. I took the paper, and my heart stopped. The name on the resume was Daniel Lawson, my ex-husband, and he had no idea this was my company. Asterisk, asterisk, I stared at the resume for a long time. Daniel Lawson. 5 years ago, that name had been attached to my entire life. My home, my plans, my identity now. It was printed at the top of a job application sitting on my desk. My assistant noticed my silence. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said calmly. "Keep the interview scheduled." She nodded and walked out. The room was quiet again. For a moment, I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. Life has a strange sense of timing. 5 years ago, Daniel believed I wouldn't survive without him. Now he was applying to work for me. But before we continue, let me ask you something. If someone who once humiliated you suddenly walked into your workplace asking for a job, what would you do? Would you cancel the interview? Would you confront them immediately? Or would you sit there calmly and let the moment unfold? Type interview in the comments if you would continue the interview like I did, because that's exactly what happened next. At 10:58, my assistant knocked on the door. "He's here, send him in." My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't angry. The truth is, something else had taken its place over the years. Distance. When enough time passes, pain changes shape. The door opened. Daniel stepped inside. For a second, he didn't notice me. He was looking around the office, The glass walls, the company logo, the employees working outside. Then his eyes moved to the desk, and finally to me. His body froze. "Emma," he said. "Yes." For a moment, he didn't move at all. He looked at the nameplate on the desk. Emma Lawson, Chief Executive Officer. His face slowly lost color. "You own this company?" he asked quietly. "Yes." He sat down slowly across from me. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he laughed softly. Not the confident laugh I remembered. A different one. Almost embarrassed. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," I replied. The silence stretched between us. Finally, I opened the folder on my desk. "Daniel Lawson," I said in my professional voice. "Thank you for coming in today." He looked at me carefully. "You're really going to do the interview?" "Yes." Leaned back slightly. "Okay." I glanced down at the resume. "You spent the last 8 years working at Northbridge Logistics?" "Yes." "And you left earlier this year?" "Yes." "What happened?" He hesitated. Then he sighed. "The company shut down my department." "What caused that?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Automation. Corporate restructuring. Lot of things." His voice was quieter than I remembered, less confident. "Let me pause here for a second. Have you ever met someone years later who used to feel powerful in your life? And suddenly, they seem smaller somehow? Not physically, but emotionally. If you've experienced that moment, type time changes people." Because sitting across from Daniel that day felt exactly like that. I continued the interview. "What interests you about Stockbridge Systems?" I asked. He gave a small smile. "Honestly, yes. I've been following the company for a year." "That surprised me. You have?" "Yes. Your software has been changing how small retail businesses manage inventory." He glanced around the office again. "I didn't realize you were the founder." I nodded. "We started small." "I know," he said. "I read about the early days in a business article." For the first time he looked directly at me. "You built something impressive." 5 years ago those words would have meant everything. To me now, they felt like simple observations. "Tell me something," I said. "When did you realize the company was mine?" He gave a tired smile. "When I walked into the lobby and saw your name on the wall. And you stayed." "Yes." "Why?" He thought for a moment. "Because leaving would have meant I was still the same person I used to be." The interview continued for a few minutes. But the truth is, both of us knew this wasn't really about a job. Finally, he spoke again. "Emma, I owe you an apology." I didn't answer immediately. 5 years earlier, I had imagined this moment hundreds of times. But imagination never prepares you for reality. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I thought success came from control." He gestured toward the office. "You proved me wrong." But the story doesn't end there. Because Daniel's life hadn't just changed, it had collapsed. And I didn't learn the full story until later in that conversation. 2 years after our divorce, Daniel remarried a woman he met through work. Her name was Claire. At first, things seemed perfect. But Daniel was still the same person he had always been. Confident, controlling, certain he understood everything. Claire had her own business ideas at first. Daniel supported them. Then he began criticizing them the same way he had criticized mine. The arguments grew worse. Eventually, Claire left. The marriage lasted 80 months. Daniel sat across from me explaining all this quietly. "History repeated itself," he said. "Yes," I replied. "People often repeat patterns they don't recognize." He nodded slowly. "I didn't recognize mine until it was too late." He looked down at his hands. "I've had 5 years to think about that dinner party." I remembered it instantly. The laughter, the sentence, "You're nothing without me." I was trying to look confident, he said, in front of everyone. "You looked confident," I replied. He gave a small, sad smile. "I was insecure." "Let me ask you something here. Do you think people who humiliate others are usually confident? Or do you think they're hiding their own insecurities?" Right? Confidence or insecurity, In the comments? Because sometimes the loudest voices are the most uncertain ones. Daniel finally looked up again. I shouldn't have said that to you. No, I shouldn't have pushed you out of the house, and I shouldn't have assumed you couldn't survive on your own. I folded my hands on the desk. You were wrong about one thing. He waited. I was never nothing. The room was quiet again. Then he nodded slowly. I know that now. The interview ended 10 minutes later. I stood up. Thank you for coming in, I said. He stood too. So that's it? He asked. Yes. You're not going to ask me anything else? No. He looked around the office again. You really did it, he said. Yes. As he walked toward the door, he paused. Emma, yes. If you had to go through everything again, would you? I thought about that question carefully. The apartment above the laundromat, the sleepless nights, the fear, the doubt. Yes, I said. Why? Because it made me someone I respect. He nodded slowly. I'm glad. Then he walked out of the office. But the story wasn't finished yet, because something happened. 2 weeks later that I never expected. Something that completed the circle. In a way neither of us saw coming. And that moment changed everything about how I viewed the past. Asterisk 2 weeks passed after the interview. Life returned to normal. Or at least the version of normal that comes with running a company. Morning meetings, client calls, software updates, team decisions. Daniel didn't contact me again, and I didn't expect him to for a while. I thought the story had simply ended in that interview room. But life has a strange way of finishing things properly. It was a Friday afternoon. My assistant knocked on the door again. You have a visitor? She said. Who? He didn't say, but he asked specifically for you. Send him in. A moment later, the door opened. Daniel walked in again, but this time he wasn't wearing a suit. He looked different, less formal, less guarded. Emma, he said. Hello, Daniel. He stayed near the door for a moment before sitting down. I didn't come here about the job, he said. I assumed. He nodded. I came because something happened this morning. What happened? I got another offer. That's good. Yes. He hesitated. But that's not why I came. Before we go further, let me ask you something. Have you ever had a conversation with someone where you could tell they were trying to say something important but didn't know how? If you've ever been in that situation, type awkward talks in the comments, because that moment felt exactly like that. Daniel finally spoke. I spent 5 years believing I understood what success meant. And now I realize I didn't. He looked around the office again. Success isn't control. No. It's building something that survives without you. Yes, he nodded. That's what you did. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. I found this last week while cleaning out the house, he said. I recognized the paper immediately. It was a letter, one I had written 5 years earlier. The night I left. The letter I had left on the kitchen counter. I took it slowly. The paper was slightly creased, but the words were clear. I'm leaving because you asked me to. But one day I hope you realize I was never your enemy. I had forgotten about that letter. Daniel watched me read it. I never opened it back then, he said quietly. I figured. I opened it last week, and he exhaled slowly. I realized something. What? You weren't asking me to believe in your business. You were asking me to believe in you. I folded the letter carefully. Yes. Let me stop here again. If someone apologized to you years later for something that changed your life, would it matter? Or would it feel too late? Typed too late or still matters. Because that moment made me realize something about forgiveness. Daniel leaned forward slightly. I can't undo what I said to you, he continued. No, I can't undo the divorce. No, but I wanted to tell you something anyway. Waited. I'm proud of you. 5 years earlier, those words would have meant everything. Now they simply felt peaceful. Thank you, I said. Daniel stood up. I won't come back again, he said. You don't have to, I know. He smiled slightly, but I wanted to see the person you became. And I underestimated you. Yes, that was my biggest mistake. He walked toward the door, then stopped one last time. Emma, yes? You weren't nothing without me. No, you were someone I didn't understand. That was probably the most honest thing he had ever said. After he left, I sat alone in the office for a while, thinking about revenge, not thinking about the past, just thinking about how strange life can be. 5 years earlier, I had walked out of a house with one suitcase. Had believed the worst moment of my life was happening. But sometimes the worst moment is actually the beginning. Later that evening, I walked through the office. Employees were finishing work. The company logo was on the wall. Stockbridge Systems 40. Employees, hundreds of clients, a system used by small businesses across the region. None of that existed 5 years earlier. All of it started with an idea someone laughed at. Let me ask you one last thing. Have you ever had an idea that people dismissed? Something others thought was unrealistic. If you have, type build it anyway. Because sometimes, the only way to prove someone wrong is to keep building until the truth becomes obvious. 5 years ago, my husband said, I was nothing without him. 5 years later, he sat in a chair across from me asking for a job. But the real ending of this story isn't revenge, it's something better, perspective. Because by the time he walked into that interview room, I no longer needed him to believe in me. I had already done that myself. My name is Emma Lawson. I'm 33 years old. 5 years ago, I walked out of a house believing my life had collapsed. Today, I run a company that helps hundreds of small businesses succeed. And the man who once said I was nothing without him, he became a reminder, not of failure, but of how far someone can go once they stop letting other people define their worth. If this story resonated with you, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoyed this story, there's another one waiting in the next video that you might connect with even more. See you.